Hi guys, welcome back to the channel. Tonight, I've got something a little dangerous for you. We're going deep into the lives of women who wore crowns, but never played by the rules. History remembers them as queens, but their courts remembered them as something far more thrilling and far more dangerous. These were women who turned desire into diplomacy, who used scandal as a weapon, and who could make kings dance on their strings. One hosted feasts that ended in whispers the church dared not repeat. Another turned her husband's palace into a stage for her private plots, and every single one of them left behind stories that still make historians blush. So pour yourself a drink, settle in, because tonight we're stepping behind the velvet curtains to meet the most scandalous queens in history. Here, history isn't a list of dusty dates, it's alive, dangerous, and full of secrets. We dive past the polished portraits and official records, straight into the shadows where the real stories happened. Every episode takes you into candlelit corridors, whispered plots, and moments that changed empires, not with armies, but with a single, scandalous decision. If you crave intrigue, betrayal, and the kind of truth that never made it into your school books, you're in the right place. The doors are locked, the candles are lit, and once we begin, there's no turning back. Before her name was whispered, in candlelit corridors, before poets and pamphleteers painted her as a siren or a serpent, the world was already a stage for dangerous games. The year was not gentle, but then again, no year was in the courts of kings. Wars had drained treasuries, and the taste of blood still lingered in the streets. Peasants wanted bread, merchants wanted coin, and nobles wanted power, but the crown could not give all three without losing itself. Beyond the city walls, muddy roads stretched like veins into the countryside, carrying rumors as swiftly as goods. Caravans of traders rolled in from distant lands, bringing silk from the east, spices from the south, and stories from beyond the seas. The markets bustled with colors and scents, cinnamon and sweat, gold dust and horse dung mingling in the same breath. But inside the palace, the air was different. It was thick with unspoken bargains and rehearsed laughter. Servants glided through corridors with the precision of shadows. Courtiers exchanged glances, sharper than daggers. Each word weighed like a coin before it was spent. The king himself, outwardly mighty, draped in ermine and crowned in gold, sat on a throne that was not as steady as it looked. His alliances were stitched together from fraying threads, treaties signed over cups of wine, marriages sealed with a smile but soured with suspicion, oaths sworn before God but broken before breakfast. This was the stage our young woman would one day step onto. She was not yet queen, not even close, but her path was already being carved by forces she could not see. Her family was neither poor nor powerful, but dangerous enough to be noticed. Her father had been a soldier who understood the value of obedience, but also when to disobey. Her mother was a lady-in-waiting, the kind who could stand behind a throne for hours without moving, yet hear every word spoken, every sigh, every shift of tone. From the moment she could walk, she was being prepared. Her lessons were not just in prayers, manners, or needlework. She was taught to read people the way others read books, to notice a lord's hesitation before he lied, to spot the twitch of a hand that betrayed nervousness, to understand why someone looked at the wine before they drank it. Maps were her childhood toys. She could name the borders of the kingdom before she could name the saints. She knew which river ran red with the blood of past battles, which forest hid outlaws, which mountain passes opened to lands where the language sounded like a song. And then there was the city itself, the beating heart of the kingdom. Its streets wound like a tangle of secrets. By day, sunlight glinted off the cathedral spires, the market stalls, the painted shutters of wealthy merchants' homes. By night, torches flickered in the mist, and the sound of boots on cobblestones echoed between stone walls. The people lived in two worlds. In the taverns, they spoke freely of politics, scandals, and royal mistakes. But in the palace, those same tongues went still. One wrong word could mean the noose. One wrong listener could be the king's spy. The church towered over it all, not just in height, but in power. Priests preached humility on Sundays and collected gold from noble patrons on Mondays. They blessed weddings and cursed enemies, deciding which causes were righteous and which souls were damned. This was the world she would inherit, a realm of shifting loyalties and silent battles, where a misplaced smile could start a war and a whispered promise could save a kingdom. She was not yet in the game, but she was already watching the players, memorizing their moves, preparing for the moment when she would step forward. History likes to pretend that queens are made by crowns, but sometimes the crown is only the final touch, the jewel placed on a head that has already learned how to carry its weight. And in that moment, before her rise, before her scandals, before her enemies would call her a temptress, a traitor, or worse, she was simply a young woman standing on the edge of a stage, waiting for the curtain to rise. Crowns are strange things. They glitter in the torchlight, catch the sun at coronations, and sit in paintings like divine symbols of order. But if you hold one in your hands, really hold it, you realize it is not light at all. It is cold, heavy, and utterly indifferent to the one who wears it. The palace, to an outsider, was a dream, a fortress of white stone, draped in banners of gold and crimson, its towers piercing the sky like spears aimed at heaven. Its gardens were cut into geometric perfection, every hedge trimmed, every fountain murmuring over clear marble basins. Musicians played in shaded courtyards, their notes floating over the air like perfume. But the walls kept more than luxury inside. They trapped whispers, grudges, and ambitions. And ambition, in this place, was more dangerous than any army. When the great hall filled for court, it looked like a festival. Noble women in gowns sewn with pearls moved like waves of silk, while lords with jeweled swords exchanged polite threats, disguised as compliments. The king sat above them all, his crown catching every flicker of torchlight, smiling the way one smiles when the knife is still hidden under the table. Behind that smile lay the truth. The throne was never secure. The royal treasury was shrinking faster than new coins could be minted. The nobles grumbled about new taxes, while the merchants demanded protection for their trade routes. Beyond the borders, rival kingdoms waited like wolves, testing the strength of the walls with the occasional raid, the occasional accidental insult sent by letter. The church pressed its own demands, its bishops moving like quiet generals, blessing the king's reign with one hand and tightening their grip with the other. And then there was the queen, the current one. She was no romantic figure. She had been brought to this palace as part of a treaty, her beauty paraded like an ornament, her presence a reminder that the king's alliances were written not just in ink, but in flesh. She bore the role with icy grace, but her eyes held storms. It was in this precarious balance that our young woman would one day step, not as a mere guest but as a player. She was beginning to understand that power was not what the bards sang about. Power was not the glitter of jewels, nor the roar of the crowd, nor the feast laid in your honor. Power was the quiet knowledge of who feared you, and why. In the lower chambers, far from the candlelit banquets, she saw the other side of the crown. Servants worked until their fingers bled, cooks stirred cauldrons the size of bathtubs, scribes hunched over parchments until the ink stained their sleeves. These were the gears of the royal machine, grinding day and night, unnoticed until they failed, and above them the courtiers spun their webs. Promises traded for favors, favors traded for silence, silence traded for survival. The most dangerous thing she learned was this: in the palace, truth was never fixed. A rumor could become fact if the right mouth spoke it. A fact could vanish if enough eyes agreed to look away. Already, her name was being mentioned, not loudly, not in public, but in the corners of the palace where deals were born. Some spoke of her charm, others of her keen mind, a few of her potential usefulness. And in a place where usefulness was the most valuable currency, that was both a blessing and a curse. At night, the palace changed. The grand halls emptied, the echo of music faded, and the corridors grew colder. The few who walked them after midnight did so with purpose, or with something to hide. Torches guttered in their sconces, throwing long shadows that stretched like fingers. She began to hear the quiet sounds of the kingdoms. Real heartbeat, the scratch of a quill in the king's study, long after the council had gone. The low murmur of voices from a locked room, the metallic clink of a chest being closed and locked. The crown might have been heavy, but the shadows it cast were heavier still. In the weeks to come, she would be drawn deeper into those shadows. Not yet a queen, not yet a scandal, but already part of the story that history would one day twist, distort, and retell. And when the day came that the crown touched her brow, she would know exactly what it meant. Not just the glory, but the weight, not just the applause, but the price. Because in this palace, every gift came with a chain, and every chain was made to be pulled. History likes to pretend that greatness begins in marble halls. It does not. It begins in the dust, in the market stalls, in the cold rooms where the wind seeps through cracks in the wall. She was not born a queen. She was born to a house that smelled of wood smoke and damp straw, in a town whose name most nobles could not pronounce, let alone find on a map. Her father, a minor landholder, carried himself with the stubborn pride of a man who had nothing else to trade. Her mother, sharp-eyed and unyielding, measured every loaf of bread as though it were gold. In those days, survival was a craft. Children learned to work before they learned to read, to listen before they spoke, and to remember which truths could be repeated and which could not. From her earliest years, she understood that the world was a game played by others, but that did not mean she would sit quietly at the edge of the board. Her beauty, the kind that would one day turn heads in palace corridors, was already there in outline. But beauty in the provinces was no shield. She learned to walk quickly through the market, to keep her gaze level but not challenging, to speak politely to men who thought politeness was permission. It was her mind that set her apart. She listened to the merchant women haggling and learned the art of pressing without pushing. She overheard travelers at the inn and pieced together a picture of the wider world, a world where fortunes rose and fell, not just with harvests, but with marriages, alliances, and secrets. Her father believed in old codes, loyalty to one's lord, obedience to the crown, honor above profit. Her mother believed in something far simpler, survival. Honor, she would say, is a fine thing, but you can't eat it. When she was 12, famine came. Not the kind that fills poets' verses, but the slow, grinding kind that empties pantries one crust at a time. Grain prices tripled, then vanished from the market entirely. Men took to selling their tools. Women sold their wedding rings. And still, the cold came early. In that winter, she learned her first great lesson. When the world begins to starve, kindness is the first thing to die. Her family survived only because her mother traded favors for food. Small favors at first, then larger ones. By spring, the household had changed. They were not poorer, but they were quieter. There were silences in the evenings that no one explained. When she was 14, an unexpected letter arrived. A distant cousin in the capital, a minor clerk in a noble household, had secured her a place as a companion to a merchant's daughter. The pay was modest, the journey long, but her parents agreed at once. There was no future for her in the town. The capital was another world entirely. The streets were wider, the houses taller, the people faster. Colors seemed richer, perfume stronger, words sharper. The palace stood above it all like a silent judge, its towers visible from almost anywhere. In the city, her duties as a companion were simple. Walk with the merchant's daughter in the gardens. Read with her, keep her company at lessons. But the role came with one advantage her parents had likely not foreseen: proximity. The merchant's household traded with minor nobles, supplying silks and fine imported goods. This meant that guests came often, and with them came stories, not the rough half-true tales told by travelers in the provinces, but the sharp-edged truths of court life. She learned to listen without seeming to listen. She learned which names drew laughter, which drew sighs, and which drew silence. She learned that a noble woman's smile could be an invitation, an insult, or both. At 17, she attended her first public gathering, a market fair blessed by the presence of a visiting noble family. She wore a dress borrowed from her mistress, a faded but still lovely gown of deep green, and carried herself as though it was silk, fresh from the loom. It was there she caught the passion of a certain lady in waiting to the queen, not with a flutter of lashes or a practiced curtsy, but with an offhand remark made at exactly the right moment. The lady smiled, not kindly, but with interest, and asked her name. That was the second great lesson. Opportunity rarely knocks. More often, it waits to see who is bold enough to approach. Within a year, she had left the merchant's household and entered the orbit of the court. Not at its center, not yet, but close enough to feel the pull. She fetched books, arranged flowers, and delivered messages that carried more weight than their paper suggested. She began to understand the unspoken language of power. Who stood where in a room? Who spoke first? Whose words were echoed and whose were ignored? She learned the value of being underestimated. By day, she was dutiful, modest, and forgettable. By night, she was something else entirely, a quiet observer, piecing together the invisible map of influence that stretched across the kingdom. And somewhere in the shadows of that map, her own path began to take shape. It was not yet scandal, not yet history, but the roots had been planted. The court of the late 15th century was a place where fortunes could be built in a single evening, or destroyed before the morning bell. For the young woman who would one day wear the crown, every step was calculated, every word chosen as carefully as a jeweler selects his finest gem. She had learned early that the palace was not just a residence, it was a battlefield without swords. The weapons here were sharper, glances, alliances, secrets, and she, though still in her youth, wielded them with the skill of a seasoned general. The turning point her rise began quietly, not with a royal proclamation, but with a marriage proposal. The king's eldest brother, a man known for his scholarly mind and distant temperament, took notice of her during a spring banquet. He admired her wit, the way she could discuss philosophy and poetry, without slipping into the dull recitations of court-educated ladies. But fate intervened. Before their engagement could be finalized, the brother fell ill and died suddenly. Whispers blamed bad wine. Others spoke of an inherited weakness in the royal bloodline. For her, the tragedy was both a loss and an opening. She was now known, at court, remembered by the king himself for her grace at that banquet. An unlikely patron every rise needs a sponsor, and hers came in the form of the Dowager Queen, the king's mother. The old queen was feared for her sharp tongue and iron will, but she saw something in the young woman that reminded her of her own youth, ambition wrapped in silk. She took the girl under her wing, offering not just access to royal functions, but a place in her private apartments. It was there, over long afternoons of embroidery and state gossip, that she learned the true architecture of power, who owed whom, which alliances were rusted, which could be forged anew. First taste of influence, the first time she shaped the course of the realm, came during a border dispute with a neighboring duchy. The king's ministers were divided, some urging for war, others for diplomacy. In the presence of the Dowager Queen, she suggested an alternative, a marriage alliance between the king's cousin and the duke's niece. The idea, delicate and seemingly harmless, won the king's favor. The treaty was signed, the threat of war dissolved, and in hushed corners of the palace, courtiers began to say, "The girl has a mind worth watching." Love, or strategy. Her eventual marriage to the king was, on the surface, a love story. He had been captivated by her intelligence and beauty, and she by his charm and vision. But those who knew her well understood that her heart was not her only guide. Marriage, to the king, was the ultimate shield and the ultimate weapon. Their wedding was a spectacle of gold and crimson. The streets lined with banners bearing the royal crest. Bells rang for hours, and poets composed verses comparing her to ancient goddesses. But beneath the celebrations, she knew the crown was not merely an ornament. It was a test. The new queen's challenger's queenship was no gentle throne. From the moment she was crowned, she was measured, not just in beauty and grace, but in her ability to navigate the ceaseless storms of court politics. Every smile could be a trap, every gift a poisoned favor. The older noble families regarded her as an outsider, a woman who had risen too quickly. They doubted her lineage, mocked her provincial upbringing in whispers. She responded not with outrage, but with calculation. Her first move was to secure her own circle. Ladies-in-waiting, loyal not to their families, but to her. She placed them strategically, like chess pieces, in the households of powerful nobles. They became her eyes and ears, carrying back information that allowed her to anticipate plots before they fully bloomed. Cultural patronage. The queen understood that power was not only maintained through politics, but through legacy. She began funding artists, musicians, and scholars, turning the court into a center of culture. Painters immortalized her in portraits, where every detail from the angle of her head to the choice of background was designed to convey majesty. Her patronage won her public favor, a shield against the daggers of her political rivals. Commoners adored her festivals, merchants profited from her taste for fine goods, and foreign visitors returned home speaking of her elegance. The first real test, her first true challenge, came not from an enemy abroad, but from within the palace walls. A faction of nobles, resentful of her growing influence, tried to undermine her by influencing the king directly. They whispered that she was too political, that she meddled in affairs meant for men. Instead of confronting them openly, she turned their own strategy against them. She invited their wives to private suppers, showered them with gifts, and allowed them to feel part of her inner circle. Soon, the men found their own households warming toward the queen. their criticisms dulled by domestic persuasion. It was a victory won without a single raised voice, the kind she liked best. From consort to carula as the years passed, her role shifted from ornamental to essential. The king began to consult her on matters of state, sometimes even deferring to her judgment in council meetings. Foreign envoys treated her as an equal to the king, addressing her directly in negotiations. The transformation did not go unnoticed, and not everyone approved. For some, she was an inspiration. For others, a dangerous precedent. A queen who could shape policy was a queen who could unsettle the entire balance of power, foreshadowing the Faliette even in her brightest days. Shadows gathered at the edges. Her rise had been swift, her victories many, but in a court built on envy, such ascent could not go unchallenged forever. There were those who bided their time, waiting for the smallest crack in her perfect facade, and when it came in the form of a whisper, a rumor, a story too delicious to ignore, it would change the course of her reign forever. The summer of 1527 arrived, not with the gentle scent of roses, but with a whisper, sharp as a blade, light as a moth's wing. It began in the market stalls, drifting between the murmurs of fishwives and spice merchants, until it reached the marble corridors of the royal court. A whisper that Her Majesty, the Queen, the untouchable jewel of the realm, had been seen alone in the western gardens, with a man who was not her husband. No one could say with certainty who started it. Some swore it was a jealous lady-in-waiting, spurned after being replaced in the Queen's inner circle. Others blamed a foreign ambassador, eager to destabilize the court. But by the time the rumor reached the king's ear, it had already grown. Teeth no longer a mere garden stroll, but an intimate exchange, a lingering touch, a shared secret. The Queen, poised as always, denied nothing, and confirmed nothing. Her silence was not weakness, it was a calculated move. She knew that in court politics, denial could make you seem defensive, while silence could make you dangerous. The setting of the scandal, the palace, was a labyrinth. Oh, shadows and gold. Every corridor echoed with footsteps that could belong to a friend or a spy. Servants moved like ghosts, slipping in and out of rooms with their heads bowed but their ears wide open. In such a place, privacy was a myth. A stray glance could become a story. A smile could be weaponized. That summer, the king's attention was occupied with a brewing border conflict. Diplomats crowded his council chambers, and couriers came and went with maps rolled under their arms. This left the Queen free from the constant surveillance of her husband, and free to be the central figure of the court's most tantalizing speculation. The man in question, he was no ordinary courtier, tall, with a soldier's bearing and the kind of scar on his cheek that spoke of battles fought for honor rather than coin. He had been recently appointed as captain of the royal guard, and though his official duty was to protect the Queen, the way his gaze lingered suggested something far less official. Some claimed they saw him walking beside her in the moonlit gardens, their steps slow, their voices low. Others swore they passed her private chambers at dawn and heard the faint murmur of a man's voice from within. Whether these moments were truth or invention hardly mattered. In a court like this, perception was reality. Why the rumor took root. The Queen's beauty was the subject of poems, her charm the envy of noblewomen and the downfall of many men. But it was her independence that truly unsettled the court. She read political treatises, debated with ambassadors, and made decisions that the king sometimes endorsed after she had already set them in motion. To her enemies, the scandal was a gift, a perfect way to undermine her influence. If she could be painted as morally compromised, every decision she made could be questioned. The spread by midsummer, the rumor had grown beyond a quiet murmur. Minstrels began composing thinly veiled ballads about a rose who bloomed for 2 suns. Market traders used it to haggle. Ah, if the Queen can have her little secrets, surely you can give me a better price. Even in the chapel, whispers trailed her like shadows, and the eyes of the faithful lingered a beat too long. The Archbishop himself sent a discreet note to the king, urging him to mind the sanctity of the royal household. Such words, carefully penned in formal script, carried the weight of both moral judgment and political pressure. The Queen's response one evening, during a grand banquet, the Queen appeared wearing a gown the color of molten gold, a hue reserved for the highest state occasions. She walked the length of the table, speaking to each guest with her usual warmth. But when she reached the captain of the guard, she placed her hand briefly on his arm. A pause, a smile, a knowing look that was subtle enough to be innocent, bold enough to be scandalous. It was a massive stroke. Her gesture could be interpreted in 100 ways, and she allowed each courtier to choose their own version of the truth. Behind closed doors, what truly happened between them, if anything at all, remained locked away behind guarded expressions and carefully orchestrated moments. The Queen understood that sometimes suggestion was more powerful than any confession. By letting the rumor live, she kept her rivals occupied, chasing shadows while she maneuvered in the political daylight. But every game has its risks, and though she held the court in the palm of her hand, a single wrong move could see it all crumble. The whispers no longer clung to corners. They marched boldly through palace corridors. Servants repeated them under the pretense of bowing. Ambassadors carried them across borders wrapped in polite conversation, and poets, always eager to gamble their verses, slipped these into ballads. For months, the Queen maintained her silence, a silence that was not submission but strategy. Those who knew her best understood this was the most dangerous phase. When her lips did not move, her mind was busiest. She attended banquets with the grace of an untouchable deity, her smile as steady as the moon's glow, even as every toast in her honor was laced with double meaning. But behind the silk screens of her private chambers, she was at work. Couriers traveled in the dead of night carrying sealed letters, each bearing a wax insignia she rarely used, an emblem not of her crown, but of her personal seal, known only to her most loyal confidants. These messages reached far-flung allies, both noble and shadowborn. One by one, pieces began to move on her invisible chessboard. A merchant owed her a debt. His ships conveniently arrived in port with rare goods that she gifted publicly to key nobles, ensuring their loyalty. A military captain who once found himself saved from disgrace by her interventions suddenly appeared at court to offer his protection should unrest break out. Even the clergy, whose approval could make or unmake a monarch, found themselves courted with unexpected donations for church restoration projects. Still, the rumors grew teeth. They no longer hinted, they accused. Some said she had plotted the downfall of a beloved courtier. Others swore they had seen her in secret council with the enemy's envoy. The most damning claimed she had manipulated the king himself, turning policy into a game she alone played to win. The Queen's patience thinned. It was one thing to dance with shadows, it was another to let them dictate the steps. She began to take subtle, surgical actions. At the midsummer feast, she invited her loudest detractor, minor noble with a penchant for theatrics, to sit at her table. Before the gathered court, she lavished him with praise for his keen observation and service to the realm, then asked him, sweetly, to repeat the exact words of his accusations. His voice faltered. Laughter, the cruel kind, that can shatter reputations, rippled through the hall. By the time the feast ended, his standing had crumbled not by force, but by the unbearable weight of his own inability to prove his tale. But the Queen understood. Cutting down one vine did not stop the growth of the garden. There were deeper roots, and she needed to find them. Her investigation was quiet, meticulous. She placed trusted eyes in the kitchens, the stables, even the servants' dormitories, where gossip bloomed most freely. She learned that the heart of the scandal pulsed in a hidden alliance between two powerful families who had long resented her influence and feared the reforms she championed. It was then that she made her boldest move. Instead of confronting them directly, she arranged a lavish tournament in the capital. The entire nobility was invited, including her enemies. On the surface, it was a gesture of unity, a grand display of the realm's prosperity. In truth, it was a carefully baited trap. Every day of the tournament, she controlled the narrative not with decrees, but with orchestrated spectacles. A knight rumored to be her secret lover publicly swore fealty to the king before the crowd, shattering that particular thread of gossip. A foreign ambassador whom the whispers claimed was her co-conspirator was granted an open audience, during which he offered rich tributes and declared his nation's unwavering alliance. By the final day, the scandal that had once threatened to devour her seemed absurd, almost laughable. And yet, in the quiet spaces of the court, a more dangerous truth was forming. She had not merely survived the rumors, she had bent them to her will. Her enemies learned a painful lesson. To attack her was to risk being woven into one of her elaborate performances, where the audience would applaud her, not them. But such victories come at a cost. Though her position appeared unshaken, the Queen knew the court would never forget. This season of whispers, they had seen her cunning, they had seen her power, and in a world where envy and ambition were as common as the air one breathed, such knowledge was a weapon, one that could be turned against her at any moment. She smiled. Anyway, after all, she was a queen, and queens, if they are wise, never let the court see them bleed. By the time the queen reached the zenith of her reign, the court no longer whispered in the same way. The air was still thick with politics and rivalry. Palace in history was ever free from that, but her name no longer traveled on fragile rumor. Now it moved on decrees, on treaties signed with wax and gold, on the kind of decisions that shaped kingdoms for decades. The throne room itself bore her influence. Once a cold hall of stone and echo, it had been transformed under her direction into a chamber of awe. Velvet banners embroidered with the realm's crest hung from gilded poles. The scent of imported frankincense clung to the air, mingling with the glow of tall beeswax candles. Even the light seemed arranged to favor her, filtering through stained glass in shades of crimson and gold, bathing her in a warm, almost divine radiance. Foreign envoys bowed deeper now. They addressed her with measured reverence, aware that their fortunes in this kingdom were no longer dictated solely by the king's hand. Her voice in council carried a weight that could tip the scales of war or peace. In matters of trade, her counsel was sought before any treaty was drafted, and when disputes flared between noble houses, it was to her arbitration that both sides submitted, sometimes reluctantly, but always obediently. The queen understood that power was not merely possession, it was performance. She mastered the delicate theater of monarchy, how to let her silences speak louder than a dozen proclamations, how to turn a single lifted brow into a verdict. She wore her crown not as an ornament, but as a weapon, a symbol that reminded everyone in her presence where authority truly rested, under her guidance. The realm experienced an era of prosperity. Trade routes flourished, guilds expanded, and the capital city became a beacon of wealth and culture. Scholars, poets, and craftsmen flocked to her court, knowing that patronage from the queen's hand was a seal of immortality. It was said that no poet ever left her hall without inspiration, and no architect without a commission. But prosperity was not born of generosity alone, it came from calculation. She had mastered the art of political balance, ensuring that no single faction in the nobility grew too strong. Allies were kept close with privileges and honors. Rivals were kept closer still, bound by debts they did not realize they owed until repayment was impossible. This was also the period in which her image, crafted so carefully over years, solidified into legend. Artists painted her in garments of deep scarlet and gold, often with a scepter in one hand and a scroll in the other, the embodiment of both command and wisdom. A famed playwright, whose works would survive for centuries, modeled his heroine after her, portraying a queen whose words could end a war without a sword being drawn. Yet, for all her outward strength, she knew the fragility of such heights. The higher one climbs, the more dangerous the fall. She never forgot the seasons of rumor and betrayal that had once threatened her crown. Beneath the opulent ceremonies and public displays, she maintained a private network of informants, couriers, and watchers. The market woman who sold oranges in the square, the boy who polished the knight's armor, the monk who copied manuscripts in the abbey, each might carry to her a piece of information that could avert disaster. Her enemies had not disappeared. They had simply learned to smile in her presence. Some waited for her to falter, convinced that age or overconfidence would loosen her grip. Others plotted in subtler ways, weaving alliances through marriages and trade agreements in hopes of tilting the balance of power. The queen countered with a mastery that seemed effortless. She arranged marriages that bound potential threats into loyalty, placed loyal commanders at key garrisons, and cultivated friendships with influential foreign courts. There was an elegance to her maneuvering, no heavy hand, no overt force. She ruled through inevitability. By the time her opponents realized her plan, they were already entangled in it. The people adored her. She walked among them during festivals, accepting flowers from children and blessings from the elderly. She funded public works, bridges, aqueducts, marketplaces that bore her insignia, ensuring that her name was not just spoken in noble halls, but carved into the very stone of the realm. Her popularity was a shield no assassin's blade could pierce. To strike at her was to risk the wrath of the nation itself. And yet, there were signs, faint, almost imperceptible, that the summit she stood upon could not last forever. A shifting alliance here, a resentful noble there, an unforeseen drought in a key province. The queen noticed them all. She kept them locked away in the private vault of her mind, never allowing the court to see her concern. For now, she was untouchable. The power she held was absolute in appearance, but she knew better than to believe in absolutes. History had taught her that the most dangerous moment for any ruler was when they believed themselves invincible. So she smiled at banquets, received ambassadors with grace, and signed decrees with a steady hand. But in the quiet hours before dawn, when the palace slept and the world seemed still, she planned. For even at the height of power, a wise queen prepares for the day when the winds will change. The year that marked her 15th on the throne began with a winter so harsh that the river froze solid for the first time in decades. Children skated across its glittering surface, while merchants cursed the halted trade. The queen used the frozen months to her advantage, holding grand feasts in the great hall, summoning lords from distant provinces under the pretense of celebration, and binding them tighter into her circle through gift and flattery. But while snow covered the land in purity, it also masked the shifting beneath. In one far province, a governor appointed by the king's council without her consent began levying taxes far beyond the crown's decree. The people, burdened and desperate, sent petitions directly to the queen, bypassing the governor entirely. She answered them with swift justice, sending a royal envoy to strip the man of office. To the people, it was proof of her mercy. To the nobility, it was a warning that her reach extended farther than any map could measure. The court chroniclers, ever eager to please, wrote of her reign as a golden age. They compared her to ancient empresses who had ruled with both beauty and wisdom, claiming that no monarch past or present had so perfectly balanced the demands of diplomacy and dominion. Statues were commissioned in her likeness, one even placed in the capital's main square, where merchants swore that pigeons avoided it out of respect. Yet in private, the queen was not blind to the fractures forming at the edges of her empire. Reports from her informants told of murmurs in the northern territories, where a duke once loyal had begun hosting clandestine councils. Across the sea, an ambitious foreign prince was marrying into a rival house, potentially uniting two powers that could challenge her influence. She acted as she always did, with precision, never haste. A shipment of rare spices was sent as a gift to the northern duke, accompanied by a letter written in her own hand, dripping with compliments and layered meaning. An emissary was dispatched to the rival house, carrying not threats, but the promise of lucrative trade should they continue to honor the friendship between our realms. These gestures were not merely diplomacy, they were threads in an invisible net she cast across the world, ensuring that even those who plotted against her moved only within the boundaries she allowed. At court, the queen's presence was a constant reminder of her supremacy. She entered the council chamber last, allowing the anticipation to build. Every movement, placing her hand upon the table, tilting her head to listen, was calculated to command attention. Her words were measured, never wasted, and when she chose to speak plainly, the effect was devastating. A single sentence from her lips could silence a week's worth of political maneuvering. Her relationship with the king was an arrangement, understood but never spoken of. He presided over hunts and tournaments, the public face of chivalric tradition, while she governed the machinery of the realm. Some whispered that she had eclipsed him entirely. Others argued that he was content to let her bear the burden of rule. Neither opinion troubled her. What mattered was that her policies held, her alliances remained intact, and her enemies stayed wary. The queen's influence even extended into the church. Though careful never to appear irreverent, she endowed monasteries, funded cathedral repairs, and hosted learned clerics at court. In return, sermons in the capital began to speak of her as the crown's guiding light and chosen of Providence. A portrait of her, kneeling in prayer, was placed in the chapel, where worshippers would pause to admire it before lighting their candles. But as the spring thaw came, so too did rumors she could not easily dismiss. One of her most trusted captains sent word that a fleet was being assembled in secret by a rival power. Another report told of unusual gatherings in the southern port, strangers speaking in foreign tongues, carrying weapons disguised as trade goods. The queen knew the pattern. Well, it was the same as in her early years, when danger had not yet learned to fear her. This was the first tremor before the storm. She summoned her closest advisers in the dead of night. No scribes recorded the meeting, no heralds announced it. In the flicker of candlelight, they pored over maps, moving markers of wood and iron to simulate troop movements. Orders were drafted, sealed, and dispatched by riders before dawn. Quiet commands to fortify garrisons, inspect harbors, and call certain banners to readiness under the guise of routine drills. To the public, nothing had changed. The festivals continued, the markets thrived, and the queen smiled from the palace balcony as petals were scattered at her feet. But beneath the surface, the machinery of war was being oiled. Her rivals would make their move. She was certain of it, but she also knew that timing was the true weapon of any ruler who wished to survive. They would act when they believed her most vulnerable, perhaps during a foreign tour or at the height of harvest celebrations. That was when she would strike first. Even so, there was a shadow she could not dispel. It was not the threat of battle, but the knowledge that her reign, like all reigns, would one day end. She had seen the faces of queens in old portraits, radiant in youth, yet forgotten in dusty corridors. The thought did not frighten her. It sharpened her resolve. If she must one day descend from the heights, she would do so on her own terms. And when history spoke of her, it would not be as a ruler who was toppled, but as one who stepped down from the throne with her crown still firmly upon her head. For now, the banners still flew, the people still cheered, and her enemies still plotted in vain. The queen remained at the height of power, aware that the climb was over, and the descent had yet to begin. The first crack in the queen's fortress did not come from a siege engine or an enemy army marching upon the gates. It came from something far smaller, almost invisible, a whisper. At first, it was easy to ignore. Whispers had always followed her. They had followed her when she was a child with no name worth remembering, when she climbed the ladders of courtly favor, when she won the king's heart. But this whisper was different. It had a shape, a direction, a purpose. It did not fade. It multiplied. For years, she had been the architect of her own destiny, outmaneuvering rivals with precision, turning rumors into weapons, bending the most powerful men in the kingdom into pawns. She had survived scandals that would have destroyed lesser queens, but the higher she climbed, the more fragile the ground beneath her feet became. Now, her enemies had learned from her. They had studied her methods in silence. They had waited for her to make a single wrong move, and in their eyes, she finally had began subtly. The king, who had once hung on her every word, started to linger over her counsel, weighing it, as if hearing it for the first time from a stranger. In the council chamber, men who used to nod in agreement now shifted in their seats, eyes darting to one another before offering alternative suggestions. Even servants she had trusted for years grew careful with their speech, bowing lower than usual, as though distance could shield them from her notice. Her pride would not allow her to see the trap being set. She pressed harder, issuing sharp commands, summoning wavering allies to private meetings, and making bold political moves meant to prove her authority. But each move only fed the story her enemies were weaving, the image of a desperate woman clawing at power that was slipping away. The betrayal, when it came, was not from the outside. It came from her own table. One of her closest confidants, a woman she had plucked from obscurity and transformed into nobility, turned against her. The promise of safety, and perhaps the gleam of a richer prize, had been enough to buy her loyalty to the other side. The queen never saw the dagger until it was buried deep. Letters she had written in confidence, filled with biting observations about the nobility and her careful strategies for steering the king's decisions, were read aloud in the royal council. Each word twisted into a weapon. The same intelligence and foresight that had made her indispensable now painted her as manipulative, deceitful, and dangerous to the realm. Gasps rippled through the chamber. Men who had smiled at her feasts now frowned as if they had always doubted her. The damage was irreversible, not because of the letters themselves, but because they confirmed what her enemies had long whispered. The queen's influence over the king was unnatural and corrupt. The punishment was subtle, but cruel. Her place, beside the king at feasts, was moved a seat farther away. Her voice in council was politely acknowledged, but never acted upon. The posts held by her family members began to vanish, replaced by men loyal to her enemies. The states she had gifted to allies were reclaimed under the guise of royal necessity. The court began to reframe its memory of her. Once, she had been praised for her boldness. Now, the same boldness was called arrogance. Her cunning was called deceit. Even her beauty was recast as a lure, a trap for the unwary. It was not enough to take her power. They had to poison her legacy. Beyond the palace walls, The war for her image raged. Pamphlets appeared in the marketplaces, illustrated with cruel caricatures of the queen clutching bags of gold while the people starved. Poets in smoky taverns recited verses calling her a foreign serpent who had slithered into the king's bed. Artists painted her in grotesque exaggerations, and even these found their way into noble halls as conversation pieces. The queen did not flinch in public. She appeared at court in gowns stitched with gold thread, her chin lifted, her eyes clear. If she was to be hated, she would be hated in splendor. But behind closed doors, she felt the erosion. Each day chipped away at her authority, her dignity, her sense of self. The final humiliation came in the form of another woman. The king, urged by his advisors, introduced a new favorite to the court, young, gentle, and seemingly without ambition. She listened more than she spoke. Let the men around her believe they guided her thoughts, and never once challenged the king in public. The queen recognized the strategy immediately. She had once played it herself. But the court had no appetite for another storm. They wanted the soft breeze of a harmless presence, even if it meant a weaker partner for their ruler. In truth, this young woman was not harmless. She was simply quiet enough to be underestimated, and unlike the queen, she had the wind of public sympathy at her back. The queen's life became a gilded cage. Her titles remained, her jewels remained, her chambers remained, but her voice was gone. The invitations that once overflowed her desk dwindled to formal notices. Courtiers bowed, but their eyes slid past her to the new center of power. She became an ornament, not a force. The irony was bitter. She had once fought to shape the destiny of a kingdom, and now she was powerless even to shape the stories told about her. In the end, her downfall was not a grand execution or a sudden exile. It was slower, more merciless, the steady suffocation of irrelevance. She still walked the palace halls, but the echoes of her footsteps no longer mattered. She was alive, yet already a ghost, and perhaps that was the cruelest fate a queen could suffer. The hall is empty now. The feast is ended, the laughter dissolved into silence, and the wine-stained goblets lie forgotten on the long oak table. A single candle burns in the corner, its flame bending and swaying with the faintest draught, the only movement in a room that still smells of spiced meat and rosewater. And you stand at the far end, where the marble meets the shadow. No courtiers, no guards, no audience, just you and the echo of your own thoughts. The crown on your head feels heavier than it did this morning, not because the gold has grown thicker, but because the day has grown longer. Its weight is not measured in ounces, it's measured in expectations. Every jewel glinting in the candlelight is a promise you made, a lie you told, a betrayal you justified. You close your eyes, and for a moment, you are not a queen. You are the girl who once pressed her ear against the palace gate, listening to the sound of music and power she could only imagine. You are the girl who swore she would stand inside those walls one day, no matter what it took. But when you open your eyes again, you are here, and the silence is not peace. It's a warning. You think of the faces you passed earlier tonight. Some smiled with warmth, others with calculation. One or two couldn't even hide the disdain. All of them waiting, always waiting, for you to stumble. Because a queen who never falters is dangerous, but a queen who falls, she's entertainment. You remember the first time you felt the sting of rumor. It came not as a shout, but as a whisper, delicate, almost polite, slipping through the air like perfume. And yet, it burned hotter than any insult screamed in your face. You learned quickly, people will forgive power, they will forgive arrogance, but they will never forgive a woman who refuses to be afraid. Your fingers drift to the pearl necklace at your throat. The pearls are perfect, but cold, just like the men who gave them to you, just like the alliances you forged with smiles and midnight promises, knowing both would be broken before the month was over. You didn't do it because you wanted to, you did it because you had to, because every step forward was over a floor of glass, and every wrong move would send you falling into a pit lined with sharpened tongues. The candle flickers, and for a second you see your reflection in the polished silver platter still lying on the table. Not the reflection they see, not the painted face, the jeweled hair. You see the lines of worry at the corners of your eyes, the faint crease between your brows from years of thinking faster than you could breathe. The shadow of someone who has learned that love, here, is just another transaction. You breathe in slowly, trying to steady the pounding in your chest. Power was never the goal, was it? Power was just the shield. What you really wanted was safety. A place where you could sleep without listening for footsteps in the hall. A life where you didn't have to smile when you were bleeding inside. And yet, here you are, safe from nothing, guarded from no one. You step toward the candle, your hand brushing the edge of the table. The wood is smooth, worn from decades of other hands, other rulers. You wonder if they felt this same quiet ache when the guests had gone home. Did they wonder, as you do now, whether the crown had changed them beyond recognition? Did they ever look at their reflection and think, I am not who I was? Your mind drifts to the nights you spent pacing alone, replaying conversations, reweighing decisions. That one alliance you made, knowing it would destroy another. That one promise you broke because keeping it would have broken you instead. And that one night, the one you never speak of, when you chose your throne over your heart. You can almost hear her voice still. The one who told you you were more than this. The one who believed the person you could have been was still inside you. You silenced her that night, but not because she was wrong, because she was right. And rightness, here, is dangerous. Your hand rests on the arm of the great chair at the end of the hall. The throne, the seat you fought for, lied for, bled for. You lower yourself into it, and it feels the same as always. Hard, unyielding, cold. There is no comfort here, only command. From this seat, you have ordered executions, pardons, marriages, and wars. From this seat, you have smiled while banishing someone you once loved. From this seat, you have watched empires bend and break at your word, and yet, sitting here now, you feel small, smaller than you did when you stood outside those gates as a girl, because back then, the dream was whole. Now, you know what it cost. You stare at the candle until the light blurs. Somewhere deep inside, you wonder if there's still a way back. Back to the girl, back to the laughter, back to the version of yourself who believed power could protect you. But the hall is so quiet, and the crown is so heavy, and the only sound is the slow, steady crackle of a flame that will burn out long before you do. You don't notice the change at first. It happens in the spaces between events, the way a friend hesitates before speaking, the way a servant bows slightly lower but avoids your eyes, the way a familiar corridor suddenly feels longer, emptier. That's how power begins to slip away, not with an announcement, but with small, almost invisible fractures. She must have sensed it too, though she would never admit it. At one time she could read a room the way a scholar reads a manuscript. Every glance, every fidget, every sip of wine held meaning. But now she found herself misreading the signs. Was that smile genuine or forced? Was that silence respect or quiet defiance? When you imagine yourself in her place, you begin to feel the weight of that uncertainty. It isn't fear, not at first. It's something quieter, more insidious, the realization that you are no longer the one steering the current, but being carried by it. There are nights you can't sleep, not because of the noise, but because of the silence. The court's whispers no longer reach your door. No one dares bring you gossip. And you realize too late that gossip was how you stayed ahead, how you saw danger before it arrived. In the beginning, you told yourself you didn't need it anymore. You had control. But now you would give anything to hear a single unfiltered truth. Here's the part no one tells you. Power is intoxicating, but it is also lonely. The higher you climb, the fewer people you can trust. And once you've lived long enough at the top, you forget what it was like to have anyone beside you who wasn't calculating their own advantage. She lived with that isolation for years, and you, stepping into her shoes, feel it seep into your bones. You stand at the mirror one evening, candlelight trembling across your face. You search for the girl who first entered this palace, the one with sharp eyes and sharper ambition, the one who could outthink anyone, who believed she could play this game and win. She isn't there. In her place is someone harder, someone who has learned to survive every rumor, every betrayal, every loss, but at a cost you can't quite measure. It's here that you begin to ask yourself the question she might have asked in secret. Did I shape my fate, or did my fate shape me? The past rushes in. You remember the nights of plotting, the days of feasts where you smiled across the table at people you despised. You remember the thrill of seeing your rivals fall, and the sting when some of them rose again. You told yourself it was all worth it, because you were building something lasting. But now, in the quiet, you wonder if all you've built is a fortress with no doors. And then there's the other truth, the one you never speak aloud. You're tired. Tired of watching every word. Tired of calculating every glance. Tired of living a life where affection is a transaction and loyalty is a coin that can be spent elsewhere at any moment. She must have felt this too, and perhaps, deep down, she knew that the cracks in her reign weren't just from enemies outside, they were from the slow, relentless erosion within. Still, there's something in you, in her, that refuses to surrender. You stand taller, even when the weight of suspicion bows your spine. You keep your voice steady, even when you feel it breaking inside. Because if you falter now, you won't just lose power, you'll lose the story. And if history teaches anything, it's that the story matters more than the truth. The final thought comes like a confession, whispered only to the empty air. Perhaps I am not the hero of this tale. Perhaps I am the villain, but even villains deserve to be remembered. And so you make a choice, the same one she made. If this is the end, it will not be quiet. You will not fade into the margins of history. You will walk into the next chapter with your head high, every step echoing like a drumbeat, daring them to forget you, because they won't, not ever. The storm doesn't arrive with thunder. It comes quietly, wrapped in silk and smiles. One morning the palace corridors feel different. Servants scurry faster, their eyes fixed on the floor. A guard you've known for years avoids your greeting, and somewhere in the distance, the sound of boots deliberate, measured echoes like a drumbeat you can't quite place. You know before anyone tells you, something is happening. It begins with a letter, folded so precisely that it looks harmless. A single seal, red as blood, stares up at you from the desk. You hesitate before breaking it, because in this place, letters are rarely just words. They are weapons, and when you read it, you feel the blade. It is an accusation, not of treason, not of conspiracy, but of something worse, disloyalty. It is vague enough to be dangerous, sharp enough to pierce the heart of your alliances. The sender has not signed their name. In the days that follow, the air grows thick. You sense movements in the shadows, small meetings in dark corners, whispers that end abruptly when you enter the room. You tell yourself you've survived this before. You've fought worse storms, but this time, something feels different, because this isn't just about power anymore. This is about survival. Then the invitations arrive. A feast, they say. A celebration, they claim. You almost don't go. Every instinct screams that it is a trap, but to refuse would be an admission of guilt you haven't even been allowed to defend. And so you dress carefully, not too rich, not too plain, the outfit of someone with nothing to hide, but nothing to prove. The hall is ablaze with candlelight when you enter. The scent of roasted meats, honeyed wine, and spiced fruits hangs heavy in the air. Laughter rises from the far table, but when you step inside, the room seems to tilt. Eyes turn toward you, then away. The air is thick with something unspoken. Halfway through the feast, the music changes. A minor key, slow and deliberate. You glance at the host, who smiles too sweetly. And then, as if on cue, the talk turns. Words become sharper, each jest a blade wrapped in silk. Someone recalls a harmless rumor, one that sounds suspiciously like the accusations in the letter. Others laugh, not at the humor, but at the spectacle of watching you defend yourself. You laugh too, because the only thing more dangerous than being accused is looking afraid. But inside, your thoughts are moving fast. Who sent the letter? How many in this room already believe it? And how many helped write it? The feast drags on. Cups are refilled, plates cleared and replaced. You try to measure each word, each glance. Somewhere to your left, you catch the faintest nod between two courtiers, a signal, perhaps, or a promise. The realization strikes you cold. This is not an open attack. It's a slow drowning. They won't strike in the light. They will let the tide rise around you until you can no longer breathe. When the hall finally empties, you linger behind, pretending to admire the tapestries. But really, you're watching the exits, the shadows, the servants clearing the tables. Every person could be carrying a message. Every gesture could be a sign. It's here, in this half-lit space, that you feel the moral fog descend. The truth is, you have options. None of them are clean. You could strike first, accuse your accusers, pull them into the same web they've spun for you. You could make an example of one, publicly and brutally, so the rest think twice. Or you could try to play the long game, outlasting the storm until their momentum breaks. But all of these come with a cost. An innocent may fall. A loyal friend may be ruined. And once you choose a path, there is no turning back. This is the curse of the throne. Every choice leaves blood on your hands. Whether you meant it or not, you remember the faces of those you've already stepped over to stay in power. You remember the bargains you made, the favors you granted, the debts you left unpaid. And you wonder, not for the first time, whether the line between justice and vengeance ever truly existed here, or whether it was only an illusion you clung to when it suited you. The next morning, the air is colder. A messenger arrives with news. One of your closest allies has been taken for questioning. No charges have been made public, but the message is clear. You are next. Standing at the window, you watch the courtyard below. Guards move in pairs. Servants whisper at the edges of the walls. A flock of crows circles above the gate. There, wings black against the pale sky. You feel the old part of yourself stirring, the part that refused to bow, that fought for every scrap of influence, but alongside it is something new, the weariness of someone who knows that even victory here might be hollow. That night, you walk the corridors alone. Your footsteps echo like a challenge. Every shadow could hide a spy. Every door could conceal an enemy. But you keep walking, because the only thing worse than being hunted is letting them see you run. Somewhere deep in the palace, you hear voices. They are speaking your name. You pause in the darkness, listening. The words are indistinct, but the tone is clear. The decision has been made. You return to your chambers with the understanding that the game is nearly over, not because you have lost your cunning, but because the board itself has shifted. The players have changed, the alliances rewritten, the rules bent until they no longer favor you. In this moment, the fog is at its thickest. You cannot tell friend from enemy. You cannot tell right from wrong. You only know that the next move must be yours, and it must be decisive. At your desk, you unroll a fresh sheet of parchment. You dip the quill, hesitating just long enough to feel the weight of what you're about to do. This letter will set the course of everything that follows. It will save you or damn you, perhaps both. And as the ink spills across the page, you realize something you've never admitted before. This was never about good or evil. It was always about survival. The night was gone, swallowed by a pale and reluctant dawn. The city, which had been a cauldron of whispers and restless footsteps only hours ago, now seemed to hold its breath. The palace looked almost innocent in the soft morning light, as though marble walls and gilded gates could pretend not to remember what had happened within them. But the people remembered. They always did. By the time the first market stalls opened, the rumors had already spread like smoke through the narrow streets. Servants whispered behind sleeves. Merchants lingered a little too long in conversation, swapping tales they weren't supposed to know. The Queen's name was on every tongue, though few dared to say it above a murmur. Some spoke with scandalized delight, others with sharpened malice. In the royal chambers, the air was heavy, not with incense or perfume, but with the weight of consequence. The Queen sat at her dressing table, her reflection fractured by the small cracks in the mirror's surface. She could hear the muffled bustle of the palace awakening, but no one dared knock on her door yet, not until they knew whether she would emerge as untouchable as ever, or as a hunted woman. Her ladies-in-waiting, usually quick to chatter, were subdued. They moved quietly, as though afraid to disturb the balance of the day. When they met her, eyes in the mirror, they quickly looked away. She understood why. They, too, were calculating whether their loyalty to her was still worth the risk. For the Queen, the morning after was always the most dangerous time. The act itself, whether it had been a calculated power play or a reckless indulgence, was only half the battle. The real war began in daylight, when every courtier, ambassador, and noble weighed the advantage of aligning with her, or abandoning her. The king's reaction was still unknown. That uncertainty was a blade at her throat. By mid-morning she knew he had heard. The walls of the palace carried news faster than any messenger. What she didn't know was whether he would confront her privately, punish her publicly, or, worst of all, do nothing at all, leaving her to stew in the knowledge that retribution could come at any time at court. Faces turned when she entered. The hall was warm with the glow of sunlight streaming through stained glass, but she felt the chill of 100 eyes assessing her. The ambassadors from foreign lands looked on with a mix of curiosity and glee. They had seen queens rise and fall before, and they knew this kind of scandal could shift the balance of power across borders. She smiled, slowly, deliberately, and took her seat beside the king. That was her first move in this new battle, to behave as though nothing had happened, as though the murmurs in the shadows were about someone else entirely. But beneath the veneer, The tension was a living thing. Every word spoken in the council chamber that day felt double-edged. Every toast at the banquet that evening seemed to carry a hidden meaning. Allies were no longer certain. Enemies were suddenly bold. The queen knew that in the game of survival, hesitation was death. She had to decide quickly whether to fight the tide of rumor head-on or let it exhaust itself in the gossip channels of the court. But in truth, the scandal had already changed her fate. Even if she silenced the whispers, the memory of them would linger like perfume in an old gown, impossible to wash out entirely. And so, as the sun began its descent and the palace prepared for another night, the queen understood. The real cost of her actions would not be paid in a single day or even in a single season. It would come slowly, in subtle betrayals, in trust eroded grain by grain. The morning after was only the first step into a long and treacherous road. She straightened her crown in the cracked mirror. Whatever lay ahead, she would face it with the same weapon she had always wielded, the unflinching performance of control, even if her hands trembled beneath the table. The next morning was colder, not in temperature, but in the way people spoke to her. Words that had once flowed easily now came out clipped and calculated. Each syllable weighed as though the wrong tone might doom the speaker. At breakfast in the great hall, she noticed the subtle rearrangements. Seats were shifted. Ali remarked. Those who had once sat within easy reach of her chair now positioned themselves closer to the king. The chatter around her was a strange theatre. Smiles without warmth, laughter that stopped her abruptly when she looked their way. Was not yet open hostility, but she knew this was how it began. The frost would spread quietly at first, until she found herself standing in a room full of people who could no longer remember how to speak to her at all. And then the small betrayals began. A favorite lady-in-waiting asked to be reassigned to the household of another royal cousin. A merchant who had always given her first choice of silks now claimed his shipments were delayed. A nobleman, once eager to offer counsel, suddenly found himself too busy with provincial affairs. The queen could almost respect the swiftness with which they moved to protect themselves. In the world of the court, loyalty was measured in profit and survival, not sentiment. Still, every departure felt like a thread pulled from the fabric of her influence, leaving her more exposed each day. The king, for his part, played a crueler game. He did not confront her, did not shout, did not banish her outright. Instead, he let the silence do his work. He invited her to fewer councils, left her name off ceremonial rosters, allowed audiences to pass without asking for her opinion. Each omission was deliberate, a quiet warning to others that she was no longer the power she had been. And yet, the people beyond the palace walls told a different story. In the streets, the scandal made her into a kind of legend, a figure whispered about in taverns and marketplaces. Some admired her audacity, others cursed her as a corrupter of the realm. But whether in praise or in condemnation, they spoke her name with fascination. She was no longer just a queen, she was a living myth, tangled in controversy. That, she realized, was her one advantage. If the court saw her as weakened, she could draw strength from the people who still saw her as dangerous, untamed. She began to appear in public more often, riding through the city with her head held high, attending masses in the grand cathedral, offering alms to the poor. Every gesture was calculated to remind both her allies and her enemies that she was still here, still unbroken. But defiance came at a cost. The king began placing subtle restrictions on her movements. Requests for travel were lost in bureaucratic delay. Her closest servants were replaced with strangers loyal to him. Even her correspondence was intercepted, letters opened, resealed, and sometimes never delivered. Her private life shrank. Conversations in her own chambers were conducted in whispers, and every glance toward the door was laced with suspicion. She had learned to sleep lightly, knowing that footsteps in the corridor could mean anything, from a harmless patrol to the approach of an arrest. The real breaking point came not in a dramatic confrontation, but in something far smaller. One afternoon, she received word that a dear friend, a woman who had stood beside her through years of intrigue, had been accused of treason. The charges were thin, almost laughable, but the punishment was real. The friend was exiled within the week, sent to a crumbling estate at the edge of the kingdom. It was then that the queen understood the king's true strategy. He would not destroy her directly. He would dismantle her piece by piece, taking from her the people she loved, the places she trusted, until she stood alone in a gilded cage, In the months that followed, the palace became unbearable. The corridors were filled with echoes of her own footsteps, the mirrors reflecting not her face, but the face of a woman she barely recognized, one marked by the slow erosion of power. Still, she refused to yield. If they were determined to strip her of influence, she would make every act of compliance seem like a victory of her own choosing. She learned to smile in the council chamber, even when her voice was ignored. She hosted small, intimate gatherings in her private apartments, cultivating a new circle of confidants, not nobles or politicians, but scholars, artists, and poets, whose loyalty could not be bought with titles. And in the quiet of the night, she began planning. The scandal had taken much from her, but it had also taught her something vital. Survival was not about holding the throne. It was about making yourself impossible to erase from history. If the court would not allow her to rule, she would rule in another way, one that could not be undone by whispers or exile. The morning after might have been the beginning of her fall, but it was not the end of her story. Not yet. History rarely gives us the satisfaction of a clean ending. When we think of queens, we imagine coronations and jeweled crowns, not the slow suffocation of influence that happens behind the velvet curtains. But in truth, her fate was not sealed by a single dramatic blow. It was sealed by a series of quiet, deliberate absences. No banishment to a distant convent, no execution in the square, just the slow turning of faces away from her, until she could no longer tell whether the world was ignoring her or simply pretending she wasn't there. And yet, the strangest part is this: centuries later, we still speak her name, not because she ruled wisely, or because she ruled well, but because she refused to vanish when she was told to. In a world that demanded her silence, she made her very survival into an act of defiance. When we look at her story now, stripped of the gold leaf and medieval banners, it feels startlingly familiar. How many of us have lived through our own morning after moments, those days when the applause fades, when the people who swore loyalty are suddenly too busy, when the job you thought was secure is taken away without warning. It's the same in boardrooms as it was in the throne room. A new boss comes in, your work is quietly reassigned, your seat at the meeting table is moved to the edge. Nobody says the word exile, but you feel it in every email you're left off of. And like her, we are often forced into that impossible choice. Do you retreat gracefully, pretending it was your idea all along? Or do you hold your ground, knowing that every day you stay will be used as evidence against you? In the Queen's time, survival meant adapting faster than your enemies could undermine you. Today, survival means learning to navigate systems that can erase you without a trace. Algorithms, corporate restructures, shifting political climates. The weapons have changed, but the strategy is the same. Isolate, discredit, replace. The Queen understood something most of us learned the hard way. You can lose your formal power and still hold influence, if you know how to make yourself unforgettable. She did it by turning her image into legend, by walking through the streets when everyone expected her to hide, by becoming a symbol of something larger than the scandal itself. In our era, that strategy might look like controlling your own narrative online. It might mean refusing to let others tell your story before you do. It might mean stepping into the room even when you know you're not wanted, just to remind them that you're still here. Of course, there's a cost to this kind of defiance. The Queen paid for it with friendships, privacy, and the constant ache of suspicion. We pay for it with stress, with burnout, with the exhaustion of living every day on the defensive. But her life leaves us with a question, worth asking. Is it better to be comfortable and forgotten, or uncomfortable and remembered? The truth is, history is full of people who were quietly erased because they chose the former. It remembers those who chose the latter, those who stayed visible, even when visibility meant danger. And here's the uncomfortable parallel. We live in an age that celebrates visibility, but only on its own terms. You can be celebrated online, today, torn apart tomorrow, and forgotten by next week. The cycle moves faster than any medieval court, but the emotional landscape is exactly the same. The Queen's morning after lasted for months. Ours can happen in the space of a trending hashtag. What makes her story so enduring isn't the scandal that started it. It's the way she responded when she realized the walls were closing in. She understood that legacy isn't about winning every battle. It's about making sure that when people look back, your name still provokes a reaction. Because indifference, in the end, is the only true death. So maybe her life isn't just a medieval cautionary tale. Maybe it's a survival manual. written in the margins of history for anyone who's ever been pushed to the edges of their own kingdom, whether that kingdom is a palace, a workplace, a relationship, or an entire online community. She teaches us that you don't always get to choose the scandal that finds you, but you do get to choose what comes after. You get to decide whether the morning after is the beginning of your end, or the start of your reinvention. Centuries later, courtiers who shunned her are forgotten. The merchants who denied her silks have no statues. The nobles who refused her counsel left no songs. But her name, tarnished, complicated, impossible to fit neatly into the moral codes of her time, still travels through the centuries, carried in the mouths of storytellers. And now, it's in yours. If you've ever felt the sting of being sidelined, if you've ever had to smile through a meeting knowing you're no longer part of the conversation, if you've ever had to rebuild yourself from the scraps of what was taken from you, then you already know her better than you. Think. Her crown was made of gold. Yours may be invisible, but the weight of holding it in place, when everyone's trying to knock it from your head, feels exactly the same. And maybe, like her, you'll discover that sometimes survival is its own form of victory. If history has taught us anything, it's that power is never truly lost, it just changes hands. And the whispers of the past don't fade, they wait. You've just walked through a world of betrayal, forbidden passions, and decisions that shaped empires. But this is only one story. There are dozens more queens whose crowns were as heavy with guilt as they were with gold, empresses who bent the rules until they broke, and rulers whose downfall began with a single, reckless night. If you want to keep uncovering these forbidden chapters, the kind that never made it into the polite versions of history, you have a choice to make right now: step back into the safety of the known, or take another step deeper into the shadows. It's not just about hearing a story, it's about being part of the kind of audience who refuses to accept the whitewashed version, the kind who wants the truth, raw, tangled, and dripping with the very human flaws that shaped the world we live in. So here's what you do: stay with us, keep the candles lit, keep the questions burning. Every week a new door opens, and behind it, a new scandal, a new secret, a new reason to wonder how much of history was written in ink, and how much in whispers. Don't just be a spectator, be part of the circle that dares to listen. The next queen, the next empress, the next empire is already waiting in the shadows. Are you ready to walk through the door?